Putin will now talk about country Ukraine is being torn apart by war. There is no other word for it. Now, pro-Russian forces want to breach Ukraine's borders. Who can stop them, and what is your policy?
I wouldn't call them either pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian. They are people who have certain rights, political, humanitarian rights, and they must have a chance to exercise those rights. For example, in Ukraine, governors are still appointed by Kiev. After the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in February, the first thing the new authorities tried to do was deprive those ethnic minorities of the right to use their native language. This caused great concern among the people living in East Ukraine.
You did not let this happen, but are you saying that we are on the verge of another Cold War?
I hope we're not on the verge of any war. Second, I insist that people, wherever they live, have their rights and they must be able to fight for them. That's the point.
Is there any risk of a war? Now, as we see tanks on their way from Kiev, many people in France are asking this question. Were you tempted to send troops to eastern Ukraine?
This is an interview which implies short questions and short answers. But if you have patience and give me a minute, I will tell you how we see it. Here's our position. What actually happened there? There was a conflict, and that conflict arose because the former Ukrainian president refused to sign an association agreement with the EU. Russia had a certain stance on this issue. We believed it was indeed unreasonable to sign that agreement because it would have a grave impact on the economy, including the Russian economy. We have 390 economic agreements with Ukraine, and Ukraine is a member of the free trade zone within the CIS. And we wouldn't be able to continue this economic relationship with Ukraine as a member of the free trade zone. We discussed this with our European partners. Instead of continuing the debates by legitimate and diplomatic means, our European friends and our friends from the United States supported the anti-constitutional coup. This is what happened. We did not cause this crisis to happen. We were against this course of events, but after the anti-constitutional coup, let's face it, after all,
but now we see so much tension in politics. Yet despite this, we will be in Normandy speaking about peace, while Barack Obama keeps urging Europe to arm itself.
Well, we must always talk about peace, but we should understand the causes and nature of the crisis. The point is, no one should be brought to power through an armed anti-constitutional coup. And this is especially true of the post-Soviet space, where government institutions are not fully mature. When it happened, some people accepted this regime and were very happy about it, while other people, say in eastern and southern Ukraine, just won't accept it. And it's vital to talk with those people who didn't accept this change of power, instead of sending tanks there, as you said yourself, instead of firing missiles at civilians from the air and bombing non-military targets.
But, Mr. President, the United States and the White House claim they have evidence that Russia intervened in the conflict, sent its troops and supplied weapons. They claim they have proof. Do you believe that?
Proof? Why don't they show it? The entire world remembers the US Secretary of State demonstrating the evidence of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, waving around some test tube with washing powder in the UN Security Council. Eventually, the US troops invaded Iraq. Saddam Hussein was hanged, and it later turned out that there had never been any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You know, it's one thing to say things, and another to actually have evidence. I will tell you again, no Russian troops.
Are you saying the US is lying?
There are no armed forces, no Russian instructors in southeastern Ukraine, and there never were any.
So you do not want to annex Ukraine, and you never tried to destabilize the situation there?
We never did that. The Ukrainian government must now sit down and talk with their own people instead of using weapons, tanks, planes and helicopters. They must start the negotiating process.
The new Ukrainian president was elected on the 25th of May through a democratic vote. Do you recognize Mr. Poroshenko as legitimate president?
I've already told you and will say it again. We will respect the choice of the Ukrainian people and we will cooperate with Ukrainian authorities.
In other words, if you meet him on the 6th of June on the beaches of Normandy, and if President Hollande helps to make this meeting possible, will you shake hands with him? Will you talk with him?
You know, I don't plan to evade anyone. President Hollande kindly invited me as the representative of Russia to attend this commemoration, even though the event it will commemorate was tragic. I was pleased to accept his invitation, and I'm grateful to the President for inviting me. There will be other guests, and I'm not going to avoid any of them. I will talk with all of them.
But will you meet with Poroshenko? You said you would only work with him on the condition that he would not totally yield to US influence.
I didn't say that he shouldn't yield to US influence. He's free to accept any influence he wants. Ukrainians voted for him and he is free to develop a policy. If he chooses to accept anyone's strong influence, let him. But I wouldn't.
Do you recognize Ukraine's sovereignty and its neutral stance with respect to relations between Russia and the West?
Yes, we recognize its sovereignty. Moreover, we'd like Ukraine to act as a sovereign state. Joining any military bloc or other rigid integration alliance amounts to a partial loss of sovereignty. But if a country opts for this and wants to cede part of its sovereignty, it's free to do so. Regarding Ukraine and military blocs, this is what worries us. Because if Ukraine joins, say, NATO, NATO's infrastructure will move directly towards the Russian border, which cannot leave us indifferent.
Mr. President, Russian troops annexed Crimea recently. Will you ever give it back?
It's a delusion that Russian troops annexed Crimea. Russian troops did nothing of the kind. Frankly,
But Crimea has been included on the map of Russia, the kind of maps we used in school. It's part of Russia now. What was it? Annexation or reunification? Which word should we use?
If you'll let me finish, I think you'll see what I mean. Russian troops were in Crimea under the international treaty on the deployment of the Russian military base. It's true that Russian troops helped Crimeans hold a referendum on their A, independence, and B, desire to join the Russian Federation. No one can prevent these people from exercising a right that is stipulated in Article 1 of the UN Charter, the right of nations to self-determination.
In other words, you will not return Crimea. Crimea is Russia. Is that it?
In accordance with the expression of the will of the people who live there, Crimea is part of the Russian Federation and its constituent entity. I want everyone to understand this very clearly. We conducted an exclusively diplomatic and peaceful dialogue. I want to stress this, with our partners in Europe and the United States. In response to our attempts to hold such a dialogue and to negotiate an acceptable solution, they supported the anti-constitutional state coup in Ukraine. And following that, we could not be sure that Ukraine would not become part of the North Atlantic military bloc. In that situation, we could not allow a historical part of the Russian territory, with a predominantly ethnic Russian population, to be incorporated into an international military alliance, especially because Crimeans wanted to be a part of Russia. I'm sorry, but we couldn't act differently.
So, François Hollande has invited you to France, to Paris and Normandy,